and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered an online keynote speech at the 5-day Davos Agenda 2022 virtual event, which began on Monday. Since 2017, President Xi has delivered 3 major speeches offering Chinese wisdom on how to view, understand, and participate in the global economy. Now, despite the ongoing pandemic and disruption in the global supply chain, China's GDP expanded by 8.1% in 2021, beating expectations and setting a new record for the decade. So, what were some of the highlights of the president's speech and how to evaluate China's economic performance in 2021? Well, to address these issues and more, I'm joined by Mr. He Weiwen, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Mr. Andy Mock, Technology Analyst and Current Affairs Commentator, and Mr. Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State of the Ministry of Economic Development in Italy. That is our topic. I'm Li Qiuyuan. So, gentlemen, let's talk about this. The president just gave a fresh speech less than 2 hours ago. It seems like cooperation has been a reoccurring theme here, whether it's fighting the pandemic, whether it's fighting climate change or global recovery. So let me start with you, Mr. He. What were your first reactions to the president's speech?
I think the president made it very clear. He recalled the past 5 years' experiences of the global developments, especially since the outbreak of the pandemic. And he reaffirmed the 2 key points. First, globalization is irreversible. Although there had been many strong headwinds against globalization, still globalization moved on without any interruption. Second, we must uphold the true multilateralism because there have been some adverse currents starting from unilateralism, then to the forced multilateralism. Actually, it's a small circleism. We must uphold the true multilateralism with the United Nations and its charter at the core.
And Andy, what about you? What are your key takeaways from the president's speech?
Well, I have 2, Qiuyuan. So, on perhaps a little bit more of a whimsical note first, I really like the image of the tiger as we are coming into the year of the tiger and the need for the tiger to sprout wings. But on a more serious note, I think what really is worth paying attention to in President Xi's speech is his call for greater coordination with monetary and fiscal policy, and that the world is not a fleet of 160 ships, but really one big one, and that we all have to work together if we're going to make the most of the opportunities, and perhaps more importantly, avoid the potential crises that could emerge, not just from public health and economically. And I think this is a very, very timely reminder because we're all probably watching this very, very closely. The United States is experiencing inflation not seen in decades. And the Fed is talking about 3, perhaps even more rate increases in 2022. And this, of course, cannot just affect the economy in the United States, but globally as well. And President Xi stressed this in his speech, that developed countries cannot just think of themselves in other developed countries, but also need to take into consideration developing countries as well. So I thought this was one of the more noteworthy parts of his speech today.
Mr. Geraci, let me get your take on what's been said by the president and what Andy just mentioned. The president really talked about the importance of collaborating different countries' macroeconomic policies, right? He talked about the developed countries should manage their fiscal policies or monetary policies to avoid spillover effects to the developing world. What's your take on this? What could be the risks here and how important is that?
The risk is there, but China always has a good weapon in its hand that other countries don't have. Because China pretty much manages the fiscal budget, the value of the renminbi, the curve of the interest rate, trade, and therefore by being completely in control of monetary policy and with a capital account that is partially open but managed, just like the renminbi exchange rate is, it actually can be shelter from any potential, let's say, speculative attacks on the currency or on the interest rate. And so, yes, the coordination is important. And in a way, I do think actually the President Xi did send a message of advice to other countries that do not have that capacity to shelter themselves. And so on one hand, he threw like a dove of cooperation. On the other hand, he reminded implicitly that if there were to be a currency war or an inflation war, China would be the one that would come out best out of it. And even more than that, also I think President Xi very subtly did send a warning message to Western United States to say cooperation is needed and we should take away the mentality of the last century, let's say, of a zero-sum game. So it is not that if China rises, someone else needs to recede. And I think I tell you, as a Western, as a former member of government with our American friends, they do believe that plus in front of China means minus in front of them. And it's this kind of frame of mind that we need to work to change, because if we don't do that, there will always be a conflict.
Right. And in 2017, the president was the first Chinese president to address the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos. He made a keynote speech underscoring China's pledge to play a greater role in the global economy. Now, Mr. He, 5 years on, how would you assess the progress China has made in fulfilling that pledge and also helping the globalization process?
Yes, first of all, over the past 5 years, China has managed a steady growth of her economy, contributing about 25 to 30% of the total world growth over the years, especially during the year 2020, when the whole world was hit badly by the pandemic and the whole contraction of the world economy. We saw China managed a 2.2 positive growth during the year, the only major economy of the world managing a positive growth. And in 2021, we had 8.1% growth. So this also contributes about a quarter or to 30% of the total world growth. And also, China has been doing her best to collaborate with different nations and economies of the world in fighting the pandemic. We have supplied over 2 billion vaccines to the world and all kinds of the supplies to over 100 countries. This also contributed to the common fight against pandemic by the world community. And also over the past few years, we have been defending resolutely multilateralism, either on the platform of United Nations, of G20, and so on and so forth. So China has been doing her commitment and making positive contributions to world growth over the past 5 years.
I also want to get your takes on China's economic performance, right? Just this morning, Monday morning here, Beijing time, Beijing released all the data for China's economic performance 2021. So these data show that the GDP in China in the fourth quarter grew 4% from a year ago, which means that the country's GDP for 2021 grew 8.1%. That is the largest jump since 2011, far exceeding the government's target of 6%, also far exceeding the global average for that matter. Mr. Tarachi, you're the expert on this. It was the first time for China's GDP per capita to exceed the global average GDP per capita. Explain to us what happened here. What do you think contributed to this high growth that far exceeded expectations?
The fact that, of course, we had an unusual 2020, so the 2021 data, which is very good, 8.1 must be seen in perspective with the weak 2020, where we had only 2.3 growth. And so what is key and what is really good about China is that the average of those 2 years, 2020, 2021, is also higher than the global average at about 5.1%. So that means that China has regained the trajectory that it was at before the pandemic. So the GDP will, of course, continue to decline as in the 5-year plan, as expected, below 6%, 5.5. So this 5.1 average for 2 years is encouraging. And what is also encouraging is a little bit talked is that the fourth quarter number that was lower than the third quarter at 4%, was, however, higher than the general macroeconomics analyst consensus that put it at 3.2, 3.3%. So there was, of course, a sequential decline, but higher than the expectation. So in a way, China, and I always say that, China is like a company that always beats the analyst estimate. There's always a little bit extra because it has a system in place that does manage challenges and difficulty in a way that it solves them. We must not forget that China has many challenges ahead. President Xi has mentioned them today in Davos, but the system works in a way that these problems are indeed solved. And for those who think that 4% in the fourth quarter is low, they must remember the reference period is the fourth quarter in 2020. And because China came out of the pandemic earlier than everyone else in April 2020, the fourth quarter in 2020 was already higher. So starting from a higher base, and of course, now we have a little bit lower growth in 2021. So that must be seen in the context of a earlier out of the crisis. So in a way, the low numbers of China means that China is exiting the crisis before other countries. 2022, new challenges we will see, and I think also new opportunities, but more so for Western countries that need to struggle still with the pandemic.
Yeah, a lot of analysts are fixating on the numbers from Q4, right? Andy, what do you think of the fourth quarter's growth number there? A lot of people say that's an indicator that the momentum is slowing down. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything that we just heard. That fourth quarter indeed was much slower compared to the rest of the year. And I think there are some reasons for that. So secular trends are very, very positive, I think, for China. There's no question about that. But we also see some of these ambitious goals. For example, peak carbon by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. And this is an enormously difficult task. So I think at least a part of why we saw a lower number in Q4 also is this adjustment or hiccups along the way that will be worked out. And some of the analysts that I follow say that, yes, of course, this is a much lower number. It would be great if it were better. But it's also building a base for a very, very strong 2022, or I should say a much better 2022 that'll be based on some long-term drivers, including the greening of China's economy. And I want to share just one number, and it's an important number, which is $6 trillion. So in terms of China's performance in 2021, as well as this longer trend towards globalization. So $6 trillion is the number of China's trade for 2021. And it's the first time that it's reached such a high level. So I think this is an indication of China's commitment to opening multilateralism, as well as the resilience of its economy.
Now, despite the overall GDP number looking great, but we do have a weaker consumer demand here, right? The retail sales increased just 1.7% in December compared to the year earlier. Mr. He, let me get your thoughts on this. How big of a concern is this?
Well, we must take a serious look at this slowing down of consumption in December. I believe this should be a temporary phenomenon due to the outbreak of some pandemic cases in different provinces and cities of the country. Once the pandemic, the Omicron is under control, the consumption will pick up again. We saw the number that during the January 1st, the New Year's Day's holiday season, China's travel volume was down 18.3% as compared with a year ago. That shows the slowing down of consumption because of the pandemic. I think the important thing, first of all, must have a success in controlling the pandemic. And then we should make better active practical help to the low-income families, to the small and medium business, in order to help them to survive and improve their conditions so as to prop up consumption.
Now, one of the moves that Beijing rolled out is in June last year, Mr. He again, the central government introduced this new policy, ambitious plan to boost rural consumption. Why is it so critical to boost rural consumption? Has it been effective in narrowing some of the gaps between urban consumption and rural consumption?
Oh, sure. We saw a negative growth of rural consumption in 2021 as compared to 2019, the pre-pandemic time. That shows, I believe, they are because of two fundamental reasons. First, there have been more young people moving from the rural areas to the cities, looking for more jobs to better pays. So they're leaving those old people in the rural area, and they will consume much less. And the second reason is the effect of the pandemic, which cut down the travels, the tourists to the rural areas, and so as to reduce the consumption in that area. We must, so in this sense, we must spend more efforts to support the rural consumption, especially the old people consumption, help those people who are still who are just out of poverty to improve their incomes, to increase their consumption ability, so as to increase rural consumption compared to the urban consumption.
Yeah, a lot of experts are also pointing out that China is going through another round of a consumption upgrade. Andy, let me get your thoughts on this. They say that this round of upgrade is characterized by very robust online sales and the demand for high quality goods and services. Where do you think, where are we with this round of consumption upgrade?
Well, I think this is still unfolding, Qiuyuan. So we've all seen the glitz, the glamour of China's Tier 1 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. But I think this is intimately tied to the push for rural development as well. So first of all, in the rural areas, there's more than 500 million people. That's 38% of China's population. They have an annual disposable income of 17,000 RMB per year, which is triple that of 10 years ago. So what this means then for this consumption upgrade is there is enormous consumption potential, not just in the rural areas, but third, fourth tier cities. And in fact, many luxury brands, many restaurants, many entertainment businesses are discovering this as well, both foreign and domestic, that in this quest for higher quality consumption, really a lot of the growth opportunities are in the rural areas and in the second, third, and fourth tier cities. And the other part I want to mention too is in parallel is infrastructure investment in rural areas, which will help facilitate not only consumption in these areas, but also more efficient sales as well of agricultural products and such to urban areas. So I think that we are seeing the completion of this dual circulation idea with the domestic wheel starting to spin.
Another new reality here is that the Omicron has found its way to China, right? It has been detected in Beijing and also its neighboring city, Tianjin. Now, tens of millions of people are under lockdown. Mr. Rachi, how do you see its impact on the economic activities here in the country?
Well, of course, there is some impact. I don't think the impact in terms of number is a lot, because what China does well is that, in a way, it encircles the areas where there are outbursts of COVID. And yes, there may be difficulties for that local economy, maybe the city or even a small area of the city, like was the case in Tianjin or Xi'an or other places in the last few months. But it never really makes a systemic negative impact on the overall economy. What it does, however, is affect a little bit the confidence. And you discussed it before, how to boost consumption. People consume when they are confident about the future. So this little outburst that just puts in the people's mind the seed that things may not be as good as they expect in the future. And when we do analysis, we do know that Chinese do a lot of saving, which is mainly precautionary saving. It was in the past because of healthcare, because of schooling and so on. Children, they need to get married, they need to have money to find husbands and wives. Now we have this fourth element of precautionary what will happen if there is a new lockdown, what happens if there is a COVID. And so in a way, we need to boost the consumption by doing what we can. And that's why I think the government could, given that it can control the COVID up to a certain point, it can then accelerate the reforms on offering social welfare for both rural and urban citizens, because then they would know that the government will be always behind them should something happen. And the consumption would then increase, because we have seen consumption, income growing, but not so much in this year, basically in line with the GDP. If we want to increase consumption, we need to have personal income grow faster than GDP. Otherwise, we never have consumption growth and we never have rebalancing, or it will take longer. So this is the challenge, and I think the Chinese government has the means to offer cheaper education, cheaper healthcare, especially healthcare. They combine the fear of getting sick with accelerating reforms in the health sector to make it basically over time available, free for everyone.
You know, the country is now still pursuing a zero COVID policy here. A lot of people have questioned that policy, as many other countries are choosing to lose their restrictions now. So I'm curious, Mr. Duraci, how do you evaluate China's policy at this stage in light of, you know, these new economic figures, 8.1% GDP growth? What do you think?
I think it's successful. I know some people don't like it, and I have a circle of friends and associates, business associates, and even people in the West that in a way are dubious about the effectiveness of this policy. But I tell you what happens. They do criticize it because they themselves personally are affected. They cannot travel. Maybe they're separated from the families. Airfare between China and Europe are now $5,000, $10,000. So they do feel there is a negative impact of them. And the mistake that they make, I'm talking about the Western analysts, they extrapolate their own personal difficulties to those of 1.4 billion people who don't really care too much to do back and forth between Europe and China. And they're very happy to see their own economy grow by 8.1%. I tell you, in my country, in Italy, we have a completely another system. As of 2 days ago, it is basically impossible for anyone to move, to take train, flights, to even go to work, to take a taxi, unless they are vaccinated. So we are taking also a zero-risk policy, but instead of China that does a mix of testing, app for tracing, and the vaccine, we went the route to only do vaccine, and people in Italy and in Europe are complaining about this because, of course, they see the movement being limited without having the economic benefits, because the economy cannot, of course, grow if people cannot travel and go to work. So we're in a little bit of a loop. So China is being a little bit criticized, but it's coming out as the winner of the model that could propose it to other countries.
Yeah. Now we're in a brand new year. A lot of financial organizations and analysts have made different forecasts for China's economy in 2022. I know that making predictions in pandemic years can be very difficult. So many predictions, forecasts didn't work out because of sporadic outbreaks, but let's just get an idea from you guys. Mr. He, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on the economic outlook for China in the new year?
I think during the starting of the new year, we are a little bit cautious because of there are many uncertainties around the globe, and both in the sense of the outbreak of the Omicron, and also in the sense of the possible risks in the world economy, especially in the financial stability. However, on the other hand, I'm quite optimistic about China's economy. I believe it will grow by between 5.0 to 5.5% for the whole year 2022. We have all the reasons, because first, the consumption will pick up. Then the production. We saw the industrial production last year grew by 9% with the high-tech. the technology sector grew by 18%. That will lay the foundation, a strong base for the further growth of 2022. And then we still have a good performances of the import and export, which will further support the economy for the year 2022. And I believe that for the second half of this year, the general situation of the world economy will further improve, which will provide a better environment for China's growth as well.
Andy, do you agree with what's been said there by Mr. He?
Well, I largely agree. So overall, I'm pretty optimistic. I think that there are enormous challenges facing the world, but I think what China has demonstrated with the 2021 economic performance is that it's really shown that some countries around the world, the U.S., for example, believes that there's a choice between economic growth and public health. And I think what China has shown is that that is in fact largely a false choice. So this gives me tremendous optimism looking ahead. And there's, I think, a couple of important growth drivers, I think, that will contribute to a positive economic outlook for China over the next few years. One, as I mentioned, is this shift to a green economy. And we can already see that in things from EV sales, the ancillary businesses and industries that supports electric batteries, charging stations, et cetera. The other big development is the digital currency, the digital yuan. And I think that is going to have a very, very big impact, not just on China, but globally as well. So there are enormous challenges. We don't know what will happen with inflation in the U.S., whether that will turn into more of a global problem, other public health crises, et cetera. But I think that China is very well positioned and has shown that it has really the ability to accomplish two seemingly contradictory goals. And that gives me a lot of optimism for the future.
A lot to look forward to. Thank you very much all to you, gentlemen. Mr. Andy Mok joining us live in Beijing, Mr. Michaela Geraci joining us live there in Shanghai, and also Mr. He Weiwen joining us live in Shanghai. That is all we have for this edition of Dialogue here on CGTN. On behalf of the whole team here, we appreciate your time. We hope to see you same time tomorrow. See you then.